Y'all ever have one of those days where you queue up ranked matches in your fighting game of choice, get tilted, and start questioning why you even play fighting games in the first place? Of course you have. We've all been there. Sometimes, if you're getting frustrated or even just bored with the game, or any activity really, it's nice to just step away from it and occupy your time with something else. Occasionally though, you'll happen across a game with its own little deviations, either because the developer thought it might be fun to include, rounds out the game package as a whole, or maybe even feeds into the gameplay loop of the main game in some fashion. Fighting games are no exception here, and there's been some genuinely incredible examples over the years of fighting games having really neat alternative gameplay modes, and that's what I want to talk about today. For this video, I want to focus on modes that are complete genre shifts. They can use the fighting gameplay from their respective series, but said gameplay has to be firmly transplanted into another genre entirely to qualify for this video. There's going to be some instances I'll leave out, like World Tour in Street Fighter 6 and Chronicles of the Sword in Soul Calibur 3, not because they don't count for this, but because I think those modes particularly warrant a separate conversation about cross-genre modes in fighting games. I was originally going to include them here, but the more I found myself talking about them in the script, the more I realized all of the stuff I wanted to talk about there goes a bit out of the scope of this video. That said, the examples in this video range from fun little unlockable minigames to full-fledged story modes that could honestly qualify as a separate game unto themselves. If there's an example you think I've overlooked, do let me know in the comments, but please don't take its absence here personally. Getting all of this footage together took a lot of time, and I'm only one person recording, scripting, and editing all of this, so I can only stuff so much in one video. All that said, let's get started. Capcom has flirted with non-fighting game submodes in a few of their fighters over time, but they actually haven't done it all that often with their flagship fighter, Street Fighter. Sure, there's the bonus stages and the arcade ladders of most Street Fighter games outside of the alpha games in 5, but there's rarely been any dedicated alternative side mode in the console ports of these games. One exception though is the Switch exclusive Ultra Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers, positioning itself as the final update of the legendary Street Fighter 2, adding new characters, slightly rebalancing the game compared to Super Turbo and HD Remix, and allowing you to switch between TPS2 style visuals and HD Remix's art style. Ultra Street Fighter 2 also comes with a curious minigame, Way of the Hado. This is a first-person minigame played from Ryu's perspective as he fights off Shadaloo grunts at their headquarters. Pretty much all of the visual assets in this mode appear to be from Street Fighter 4, but touched up, including Ryu's character model, which can be seen when you clear a stage or get a game over. Street Fighter V was out for at least a year at this point, but considering the Sony exclusivity there on consoles, I wouldn't be surprised if using Street Fighter V assets for anything outside of it wasn't an option. Notably, this minigame is controlled with the Switch's Joy-Cons being used in split play mode, as this is a strictly motion-controlled minigame. You make different motions to simulate the standard Shotokan moveset, the Hadoken, the Shoryuken, and the Tatsu, as well as the Shinku Hadoken and of course, blocking. There's a little training mode where you can practice the inputs as well. But trust me when I say you'll be fighting the controls in this game more than you'll be fighting Shadaloo. Hadokens and Shoryukens usually work okay enough, but the motion you need to do for the Tatsu is finicky at best, and I found myself either accidentally doing Hadokens instead or having nothing come out at all. There's a bit of delay before blocking becomes active too, so that's something you also have to keep in mind in the heat of the moment. There's 3 main stages, the expert one specifically ending with a boss fight against Bison, who will teleport, head stomp, and psycho crusher you, though like in traditional Street Fighter, you can blow up his head stomps with a well-timed anti-air. Upon clearing a stage, Ryu earns points which can be allocated to different stats, which can make playing the game easier, though you'll have to grind those same 3 stages to do so, and if you can beat them reliably, what's even the point? I appreciate this mode's existence, since I'll always advocate for side modes like this in fighting games, but as is, I think Way of the Hado works better on paper than it does in practice. One fighting game IP that took its single-player content offerings very seriously though was Rival Schools. With such a fresh, diverse cast and an atypical setting for a fighting game IP, it frankly would have been a waste if they didn't. Released in arcades in 1997, the game received a PlayStation port in 1998, sporting a bunch of new content, like the gym teacher Hayato and Akira's older brother Daigo as new playable characters, and completely voicing the story scenes for each of the characters' story mode routes throughout the game, on top of several new modes. This was split into two separate discs that came with the game. First is the arcade disc, which had the standard fighting game console port package, arcade mode, local versus, and training mode. However, the second disc contained the evolution disc, and this is where the good stuff is. Beating the game with Shoma, Natsu, and Robert on the highest difficulty each will unlock a minigame featuring them and the sport they're associated with in-game, though in Roberto's case you actually unlock two minigames. The first is Home Run mode with Shoma. This one's pretty simple. It's a home run derby with Shoma, and the goal is to hit as many home runs as possible. I always liked how the stadium stages in both this and Project Justice advertise other than current Capcom games in the background, like the visible ads for Resident Evil 2 and Tekken Impact. The second one is Service mode, played with Natsu. This one's a little more involved. The goal is to hit as many of the face targets as possible to maximize your score, though you have to avoid hitting the Raizo ones or you'll get a score penalty. The Shoma ones grant the highest amount of points per hit, probably because both he and Natsu are largely established to have a crush on each other. Aww. Hitting more than one target in one go also adds a score multiplier, which you should ideally aim for as well. Roberto's first minigame is Target mode. The goal has a board set up in front of it with different point values depending on its placement on the board, and the goal is to hit as many of these as possible. Pretty easy and self-explanatory game. The second mode is Shootout mode, and this one's a little harder. You and the opposing player get 5 tries to shoot a goal past the opposition, getting 5 offense and defense turns each. This one was always the one I struggled with growing up, since it seemed like it was total luck getting a goal on the computer, though I later learned that there's a specific blind spot on the right that the computer almost never blocks, so it's a matter of shooting at the correct height and angle to hit that spot. The Japanese version of the game contains all of this content plus an additional mode, Nekketsu Seisyun Nikki, which roughly translates to Fighting Spirit Diary. This was an all-new mode that allowed you to create a custom character and build out their stats and moveset in the form of a visual novel-styled game, where you interact with and go to school along with the rest of the game's cast. This mode was considered for the game's international release, but was cut as it was considered to be too large of a localization endeavor at the time. Rival Schools would later get an expanded release the following year, subtitled Nekketsu Seisyun Nikki 2, released only in Japan. This adds some new minigames, a new stage, a new move or two, and 2 new characters. This tends to get shorthanded to by English speakers as Rival Schools too, though that's not entirely accurate. The subtitle sequel naming is in reference to the School Sim minigame, which has now been largely expanded. The character creation options have been expanded a bit from the initial Japanese release, and include more hairstyles and facial features, though your outfit is still the same generic student one. You play out an entire school year in this mode, first being greeted by Chairperson, where you select which high school you'll be representing, and over the course of the first day, you will register in clubs under a club leader. This is important, since being in these clubs and doing activities in them are how you raise your stats. You can actually use your created character in this for other game modes, though their movesets and stats will be affected by your progress in the sim mode. So if you take your freshly created character from the first day of school and put them in arcade mode, they're gonna struggle with low HP and attack stats. You also get a placement exam administered by Kyoko at the beginning of the mode too, quizzing you on aspects of the game. Failing doesn't impede progression, just determines your starting stats, though failing it like I did results in losing a few points in your intelligence stat. The neat thing about this mode is that the side characters that are either offhandedly mentioned in arcade mode endings or supplementary material show up in sizable roles here, like Shoma's brother, who's head of the baseball club, and previously only had a cameo in Shoma's arcade ending. Over the course of the year, you will partake in all sorts of activities with the cast, like beach outings and field trips to the amusement park. I got dragged into helping Ron find the perfect spot to take a photo and ended up spending the rest of the day being chased by her because I took her to a boring photo op spot. The relationships you build with these characters are also tracked, and this affects what kind of ending you get at the end of the school year. The already previously talked about minigames are in this mode as some of the training exercises you undergo, with your choice of high school determining your opponents in them, though there's 2 new minigames as well. The first is 100-meter dash, where you race against another opponent. In the sim mode, your opponent is based on which high school you chose to attend, but the standalone game lets you choose your opponent. If you end up racing Hio, good luck. I still haven't beaten him. The next one is a dance minigame called Dokiwaku Dance that more or less plays like Simon Says, though it can get a bit tricky, especially if you miss an input. You don't have to make your inputs with the exact same timing as the computer does, which is nice. As long as you press the correct buttons, it'll still register as correct. Like the previous minigame, you can also select your opponent for this one as well. I know it's a long shot, but I'd really love to see this fan translated someday. I was able to use a combination of my admittedly awful Japanese comprehension and Google Lens to play through most of this mode, but it's such a unique little mode with a ton of heart put into it that I think people should experience at least once. The Japanese Dreamcast release of Project Justice brought customizable versions of Edit Fighters back, with a similar gameplay loop of playing through a sub-game to determine the custom character's stats and moveset. This comes in the form of a board game now, where you can partner up with the cast who will have certain effects on your stat progress. Sometimes they'll even task you with missions, like Roberto here, who wants your help returning a misplaced soccer ball to the sports department office. Successfully completing errands like this gets you more points in the board game overall. Occasionally, you land on battle spots, where your custom character and a CPU-controlled one will have a small little animated scuffle, with the winner being determined seemingly based on who has the higher stats. At the end of the game, you'll watch both your custom character and the CPU duke it out in the game's actual combat to determine the winner of the game. If you have a partner character and win, you'll also get a little ending for them exclusive to this mode as well. As in the first game, you can save this Edit Fighter and use them in other gameplay modes as well. It should be noted that the upcoming re-release of this game in Capcom Fighting Collection 2 is based on the arcade version, which only has pre-made edit characters, so no board game or character creator there. It's nowhere near as intricate as the previous sim mode, but it's still a really thoughtfully put together way to implement something that honestly could have just been a lot more boring a process. Alright, I'm not going to pretend I have a big attachment to the Fate franchise or anything, but when I was in high school, I had a friend who was really into it, and he also happened to be my plug for dank-ass Japan-only fighting games. And that ended up being how I learned about Fate Unlimited Codes, which released in the arcades before being ported to PS2 and PSP later on. This one's an aiding joint, though the original plan was for Kavia to develop it. Capcom, the game's publisher, instead handed development duties over to aiding in lieu of Kavia to get the game out, since the latter had been going through some financial difficulties. It's a 4-button game with 3 attack buttons and a guard, somewhat similar to Soul Calibur. Pretty much all of my experiences with the game come from the PSP port, having a lower frame rate and a bunch of balance changes, though the PS2 version is still the preferred version by the player base due to more or less being arcade perfect. It's generally considered Kusuge, and the reason why is immediately apparent after spending a few minutes with it, but it's the good fun kind, where the truckload of busted things add to the game's charm overall. The PS2 and PSP ports add a mission mode, with missions ranging from performing a move or mechanic under certain conditions to straight up combo trials. However, nearly every character in the game has a bonus unlockable EX mission, and this is where the fun really starts, as these are full-on minigames. One minigame, for example, has you essentially pressing buttons in sequence to defend against attacks, but the window you have to do so decreases the more successful defenses you have. Cool looking minigame, even if it gets kind of hectic after a while. There's another one where you have to cut apples being thrown at you, while being cognizant of their height so you can accurately target them. This one, that's basically a single plane beat 'em up. And then there's this one. I'm sure there's probably some inside jokes I'm missing. Okay, that's pretty fucking hilarious even without context. What makes most of these games work is that the vast majority of them are pretty short and don't overstay their welcome, yet are satisfying enough that you'll probably want to play them more than once. There's this really funny one where you're basically slap fighting, and you can straight up parry the opposing character if you time your defenses properly. And then there's this spicy tofu eating one, which I'm sure is probably referencing something, so if y'all can give me the context, I'd really appreciate that. There were 2 I found really interesting that I wanted to specifically highlight. First is Casters, which has its own title screen, signifying that this one's gonna be a little more involved. This one's a jaunt into aiding's other bread and butter genre outside of fighters, shoot 'em ups. It's named Kashooter, a horizontal shoot 'em up with multiple stages. It's actually pretty fun, even though bullet hell shoot 'em ups aren't my preferred flavor of the genre. The other really interesting one is Gilgamesh's, where you have to use certain commands to damage and immobilize an approaching berserker. This one's about paying attention to what commands berserker is likely to do the next turn and building up your points for your own commands to counteract that. This one's slower paced, but no less satisfying. It took a bit to wrap my head around, but eventually I figured things out. Honestly, I'm impressed with the sheer amount of variety on display here. No two minigames play alike, and there's a unique one for all but one character on the roster, which is kind of an achievement in my book. In fact, it wouldn't even be the first time Aiding pulled off this very same feat. Aiding went on to partner again with Capcom for Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, also released in 2008 in arcades and Wii very shortly after. Like Fate Unlimited Codes, the console release of Tatsunoko vs. Capcom has some content that the arcade version lacks, and also like Fate, one of those additions is a minigame mode with a game for every member of the playable cast. These games all use the Wii mode in either vertical or horizontal mode, depending on the minigame, and like Fate, spans different genres. Ken the Eagle's minigame is a gallery shooter. Hit the Galactor members in Burikatse and make sure to avoid hitting Chun-Li and Yatterman. June the Swan has a skydiving minigame. She's actually deceptively difficult to control here, so keep that in mind when you play this. Yatterman's is interesting. You basically watch the Yatterwan mech tear across a field, and you have to hit the brakes just before the danger mark on the other end of the field. There's a trick where if you know where to look on screen, you can time your button press to get a perfect result every time. Kashan's minigame is a friender race. You just mash the A button for this. Palomar's has you make a spinning motion with the Wiimote to drill through rocks. Duronjo's minigame is a slightly expanded version of the minigame that can be played during arcade mode's credits, though you have to collect coins now. Garrus' minigame has you swing around wildly to rack up kills. Ipatsuman's is a baseball target practice game that actually kinda reminds me of Roberto's target minigame from Rival Schools. Hakushon's has you answer basic math questions. And Lydon's has you wave the Wiimote wildly to clean dirt off of him. No matter how fast I waggle the controller, I can never seem to beat the computer in this one though. Lastly, Tekkaman's has you build up speed and power with Pegasus before chucking his space lance clear through a line of enemies. On the Capcom side, you flick the Wiimote to fire off Hadokens with Ryu. Doing it perfectly results in Ryu throwing out the Shakunetsu Hadoken, which is interesting considering Ryu doesn't actually have that in his moveset in the proper game. You mash A in Chun-Li's minigame to make as many statues of Ryu as possible. You have to rotate the Wiimote a bunch to get Alex to pick up and start spinning a car, then you have to press B at the right time to launch it. Batsu's is perhaps a nod to his own series, another Simon Says minigame similar to the dancing one in his home series. Morrigan's is funny. She uses her Vector Drain command grab on Kashan and lifts him high into the air, and you press A as the icons line up with the line on the meter to build up speed. Right before she slams him into the ground, you have the opportunity to press A for a score bonus. Don't know what he did to piss her off, but I'm sure he'll be alright. Soki's is a minigame where you have to destroy projectiles homing in on you. The closer the projectiles are to you when you cut them down, the better your score bonus. Volnuts is a memory game. You watch servbots go in and out of a box, and you have to correctly point out how many total servbots are in the box when time is up. Rolls is a vertical scrolling game where you have to sweep up as much dirt as possible. This one can be tricky, since Roll actually has a fair bit of momentum when moving in a direction. Beautiful Joe's involves pressing A at the right time to snap a picture. You have 3 tries, though sometimes he'll fake you out. Listening for sound cues helps more than anything in this one. Saki's is another gallery shooter similar to Ken's, though now you're shooting asteroids instead. Point away from the screen to reload here. PTX has the most interesting one here, as it plays to aiding strengths again, being a multi-stage shoot 'em up, this time a vertical one. You can collect power-ups, life recovery items, and partake in boss fights as well. Unfortunately, all of these minigames were cut in the game's international update, Ultimate All-Stars. All but one. PTX's minigame, perhaps due to already having a strong foundation, was not only retained, but expanded with more content such as new stages, new playable characters, and a branching path system, and made its own unlockable mode, Ultimate All Shooters. To unlock it, simply collect the letters spelling out "Thank you for playing" during the credits. The easiest way to do this is with Ro, since beating arcade mode with her gives you an easier version of said credits minigame since she can freely fly. There's several new stages here that can be accessed under certain conditions. For example, having a score of 1100 or more when beating stage A unlocks the alternate path to stage C instead of B as you'd normally play. Ryu, Tekken Man Blade, and Ken the Eagle are also playable here, and they're not just for cosmetics, they actually play differently. Ryu has a slower projectile with his Hadokens, but they hit pretty hard. Ken can only fire 2 bird run at a time, but they home in and always return to him. And Blade actually has no long range attacks and has to get in close to attack. According to Neo G, a former Capcom and SNK developer behind the mechanical design of some of Capcom's biggest fighting and action games, as well as one of the lead designers of Samurai Shodown 2019, they kinda got carried away with expanding the mode, but hoped that it would be a palate cleanser between ranked matches and Ultimate All-Star's new online mode. Most people playing JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Heritage for the Future these days are usually doing so through Fightcade, and rightfully so. The HD version was only ever available for a short time on PS3 and 360. The Dreamcast version has some speed and move property inaccuracies that don't quite line up with the arcade version, and the PS1 version is, well, the PS1 version. That said, the PS1 version is kind of wild for what it is. It's a full-on conversion of the CPS3 arcade game to the PS1, a system that very noticeably struggled with ports of CPS2 games. To make up for the audio-visual cutbacks though, the PS1 port has a bunch of unique content that no other version of the game has, including a revamped version of the story mode already available in the arcade release, now called Super Story Mode. Super Story Mode is pretty much a straight adaptation of JoJo Part 3, but instead of playing through separate arcade runs from the point of view of a single character, all the pertinent fights throughout the plot are stitched together in one full run instead, with a whole heap of new stuff. Super Story Mode adds in a bunch of entirely new stages, and some of them use the game's fighting mechanics, though in ways somewhat atypical of most one-on-one fighting games. But then, Super Story Mode starts throwing in complete genre shifts, featuring stages that feature fighting but more akin to a brawler or even no fighting whatsoever. The one you run into most often are adventure stages, which play out like a visual novel, fitting for a manga adaptation. Every now and then during these stages, you'll have to complete a series of QuickTime events, and your success in pulling these off determines your rank at the end of the stage. There's a gallery shooter stage that adapts Jotaro's confrontation with Forever the orangutan on the freight ship, and accidentally hitting the stowaway deducts life from you. There's brawler stages where you have to beat a bunch of enemies until the boss shows up, a hide-and-seek stage against that one stand user that hides in a mirror, and even an entire shoot-'em-up stage. Just when you think things can't get any more varied, the games start getting even more esoteric, like betting on what direction a cat is going to go to get food, and even poker. The games in this mode can also be unlocked for play separately without having to do Super Story Mode again, which is nice for anyone wanting to practice them. Honestly, shoutouts to Capcom for not only making a CPS through the PS1 port work, but actually giving it value in spite of its technical shortcomings. Really puts the PS1 versions of the Marvel vs. games to shame. Speaking of crossovers, one of the biggest reasons behind this video was finally getting to talk a bit more in detail about one of the best portable fighting games ever made, SNK vs. Capcom Match of the Millennium. Released in 1999 for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, this game kicked off SNK and Capcom's set of separately developed crossover games. And to say this game is a huge labor of love to both companies as a fighting game and as an overall package would be really underselling things. On top of the wealth of traditional fighting game content available in the game, there's the Olympic mode. This is a dedicated minigame mode where you align yourself with either SNK or Capcom characters and compete in minigames corresponding to each company's franchises. Winning points in this mode also plays into the regular fighting game side of things. You can use the points earned here to buy unlockable supers for every character on the roster, and some of these range from moves that might have debuted in a recent game for a character, to deep cuts like Danzo Toko Michi, which at that point, had only ever been in Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. When starting the mode and you're asked to ally with either SNK or Capcom, you're greeted by the team manager for each side, Rimururu, Nakaruru's sister in Samurai Shodown for the SNK side, and Kanan Kanzuki from Street Fighter on the Capcom side. At first, they're kind of dismissive and rude to you, but as you start getting better ranks in the minigames, they slowly become more cordial and over time, even start developing a crush on you if you hit the highest ranks. You can even check up on them with the talk function, and there's a surprising amount of unique dialogue for both characters that correlate to your progression through this mode. Really cool thing to add for a side mode, all things considered. So, let's talk about the minigames themselves. On the SNK side, you get Target 9 and Blade Arts. Blade Arts has you play as Jubei from Samurai Showdown as you cut down Strawman training dummies, the location of his slashes corresponding to a button press and a direction. This one can get hectic, since they'll start appearing on the ceiling as well, and some faster red ones will also occasionally spawn. Target 9 is a Metal Slug themed target minigame where you play as Marco and try to shoot down as many Mars people as possible on a 9x9 grid. This one's simple, but surprisingly addictive, and the way the Mars people start utilizing teleportation to disorient your aiming makes it so that you really have to pay attention. On the Capcom side, we have Ghost Trick, unrelated to the amazing 2010 game of the same name from Capcom, and Catwalk. Ghost Trick is Ghosts and Goblins themed and has Arthur hopping over pits to collect treasure, though a red armor will pop out of them frequently, so you have to watch where you jump. Of all the minigames, this one's the easiest, so it might be the one of choice to grind out those Olympic points if you want to. Catwalk is a rhythm game starring Felicia, set to one of 6 character themes in the game. Timing the button presses with the line in the top right of the screen and chaining them to get a high score is the idea here. The songs aren't all equal either, some are more difficult than others. I think my favorite thing about Olympic mode are all the little Easter eggs that can be triggered in it that exist for the sole purpose of fan service. For example, in Catwalk, if you press the option button to select the song instead of the A button, Felicia will instead play the game in her player 2 color, and all of the button indicators will change to things like mice, actually making it a little trickier to parse what button is what. In Target 9, if you press the option button before the ready indicator appears on screen, you play as Metal Slug fan favorite Fio instead. Though, aside from the player portrait changing, this has no practical effect on the minigame itself. If you get a high score with her though, she'll appear in place of Marco on the record screen instead. Speaking of the record screen, there's also a few minigames that are more fighting game oriented, like a mode where the first person to land an attack wins, and these can be played with any character. However, if you manage to earn a medal with Ryu, if you go to the records menu and view the record, you'll see Sagat and Bison on the podium with Ryu absent and the team manager loudly wondering where Ryu went, and on to a Street Fighter 2 ending where he posed the same thing. No one loves fighting games more than other fighting game developers, man. If you think Match of the Millennium is the only fighter on the platform with a ton of content, you'd actually be mistaken though. One of the more overlooked fighters on the platform compared to SNK vs Capcom is The Last Blade Beyond the Destiny. Outside of the aforementioned crossover, most SNK fighters on the platform are miniaturized counterparts to Neo Geo arcade games. Fatal Fury First Contact is basically mini Ryu Bout 2, King of Fighters R2 is mini KOF 98, and so on. Beyond the Destiny is unique in those regards. The game initially presents itself as a portable adaptation of Last Blade 1, but the longer you play, you start accumulating points that allow you to collect scrolls. Scrolls unlock various things throughout the game, like endings, art, and even additional characters. But then, you start unlocking story paths for characters that tell their Last Blade 2 story, even allowing Kaide to play in his awakened form from that game. And soon after that, you can straight up start unlocking Last Blade 2 characters, and you realize the game is actually a combination of both entries. It's really cool stuff. One of the things you can unlock after playing the game for a few hours are a duo of minigames. The first is Home Run Competition. In this one, you play as Juzo while Akari serves as pitcher and try to hit as many home runs as you can. Juzo notably has a power meter you use to determine the strength of your swing that you rapidly tap beforehand. You also have to pay attention to how Akari pitches. You'll get a quick pop-up showing a swirl on a grid being highlighted, letting you know what direction to hold as you swing. Might take a bit of getting used to, but you'll get the hang of it in no time. This one can also be played in multiplayer as well, either through a link cable on Neo Geo Pocket hardware or via local multiplayer on Switch and PC. It's incredibly easy to rack up points in this game to buy more scrolls, and thus more of the game's unlockable content, so I highly recommend buying this first. You have to have played the game for 90 minutes to get it to show up in the shop. It'll be the third scroll in the extra section. The second one is Escape from Hell's Gate, starring Mukuro from Last Blade 2. This one has him trying to, well, escape from Hell's Gate, one of the main focuses of Last Blade's story in a vertical shooter-esque game, though there's noticeably no actual combat at all. The way the stage is oriented vaguely reminds me of Twinbee for some reason. Do note that to get the scrolls to unlock this, you have to have played for at minimum 4 hours, and time in training mode doesn't count. Multiplayer mode does work though, so if you have 2 controllers, start up a local versus match, go do something else for a few hours, come back, finish the match, and you should be good. It'll be the 8th scroll in the extras mode. While we're here, the Last Blade 2's Dreamcast port actually has a hidden Hanafuda card minigame that can be unlocked by beating the game with any character without continuing. Easier said than done considering how BS the AI in Last Blade 2 can get. Once you do that though, you unlock the Hanafuda option on the main menu. I've never been good at this sub-game, but it's neat that it's there. The original arcade version of Last Blade 1 actually has a minigame hidden in its code that's not normally accessible by normal means as well. Matt Greer has a really informative video on the subject that I'll link in the video description that goes in more detail on what it is and how you can maybe play it. You can't talk about side modes in fighting games without talking about the arguable king of them, Tekken. Tekken, more than other fighting game series, realized early on the benefits of having a wealth of content available for consumers buying their arcade ports in the console market, and this is clear even going back to the PS1 days. Of all the Tekken side modes, I'd have to say my personal favorite is Tekken Force, which debuted in Tekken 3's PlayStation port. This took Tekken 3's gameplay and inserted it into a belt-scroller beat-em-up comprised of 4 stages and 4 bosses. You can choose any of the characters you've currently unlocked in the game for playing it, and though the stages are always the same, your experience is going to differ a bit thanks to how every character plays differently just by virtue of the main game's character balance. There's also some replay value in this mode as well. Beating this mode once grants you a bronze key and a vague to-be-continued message. Beating it 2 more times grants you a silver and gold key, along with the aforementioned message. Beating it the 4th time will unlock a secret fight against Dr. B after the Heihachi boss in Stage 4. Beating him here unlocks him in the main game. Hopefully you have a good amount of patience though, because this game, as cool as it is, gets a bit frustrating. The game pretty much controls exactly as the main fighting game does, with all the pitfalls that brings. The automatic lock-on gets really wonky, especially when 2 enemies decide to surround you, and it can feel like kind of a crapshoot to get some hits in there. Doubly so since the AI can get comically aggressive. The way I always beat this mode as a kid was choosing Paul, just spamming Burning Fist throughout all 4 stages. Still seems to work too. I do appreciate that the bosses for stage 1 through 3 are all different depending on which character you chose, which is a nice touch. The stage 4 boss is always Heihachi though. Tekken 3 also introduces another mode that's going to be a staple, Tekken Ball. This one's volleyball but with a Tekken twist. As you attack the ball, what you do dictates how much damage it will do if it hits the opponent. If your opponent hits it with an even stronger attack, the damage total is compounded. This sets up a really fun push and pull dynamic, which gets even crazier considering all of the offensive options Tekken characters tend to get. You can play against the computer for this, but it honestly really shines best in local multiplayer with a friend or family. Next up is Tekken Tag Tournament, which introduced another staple side game, Tekken Ball. This one's a bowling minigame, though it's definitely a little more straightforward compared to Tekken Ball. There's still a good bit of Tekken zaniness going on, like Yoshimitsu being able to utilize a targeting ridicule when lining up his shots. If you overshoot the power meter you use to launch the ball, your character comically gets dragged by the ball down the bowling lane, something future incarnations of this game make sure to keep. I just love that in the Tekken universe, True Ogre can pull up to the function and not a single other person at the bowling alley will pay it too much mind. If you score 200 points, you unlock a jukebox feature for this mode as well. Tekken 4 features the return of Tekken Force, though it's been tweaked in a few noticeable ways. Instead of being oriented the same way as most belt scrollers, it's now an over-the-shoulder beat-em-up, not unlike the kind of orientation games like God Hand would adapt. The controls are still largely the same, though you do finally get a manual lock-on system. It's still kinda funky, and the perils of putting fighting game movement into a single-player beat-em-up is still apparent, but it's less of a frustrating experience controls-wise. What is frustrating is how difficult the mode is. I remember it being hard as a kid, but I could barely make it past the 2nd stage this time around. I need to practice more. Thankfully, there's not much in the way of unlockables tied to this mode, just the JoJo stage is unlocked by beating this. Tekken 5 takes the direction Tekken Force was going in and goes in a somewhat new direction, eschewing the faux beat-em-up control framework, going for a far looser action game instead, The Devil Within. It's still a little jank, still plenty difficult, and the environments early on could get pretty repetitive, but it's probably the best controlling of the brawler subgames in the series so far. Jin has the ability to punch and kick, but also jump as well. You'll be putting that jumping to use, since there's some light platforming in certain instances, and it works as an okay, if unreliable defensive mobility option as well. Like some action games of the time like Devil May Cry, Jin has the ability to power up and become Devil Jin for a short time, strengthening his attacks. There's a few unlockable sides to this mode as well. It's one of a handful of ways to unlock Devil Jin in the full game itself, and in the game's 4th stage, you can find a treasure that will allow you to unlock Namco's rail shooter Starblade for play from the arcade history menu. This is the same game that pops up as the loading screen game when you first boot Tekken 5 up. This is actually one of the only legal ways available to play the arcade version of Starblade today, funnily enough. Just goes to show you how important preservation is these days. On that note, let's actually rewind back to Tekken 1 for a sec, since Namco also utilized their patent on loading screen minigames there to implement Galaga during the game's initial boot sequence on PS1. There's a point to playing it though. Getting perfect scores on all of the challenge stages unlocks Kazuya's devil costume, though it'll definitely take a bit of learning Galaga patterns to do so. Good luck. Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection on PSP understandably lacks Devil Within but brings back Tekken Bowl, which largely works the exact same way it did in Tekken Tag. Tekken 6 takes Tekken Force and for the first time makes it the game's canonical story mode with scenario campaign, featuring Lars and Elisa as the protagonists, navigating the events of the game and Jin's declaration of war in the world. You can unlock the greater cast as playable characters in this mode as well, and depending on the character selected for the level, they might even have some unique dialogue here and there. Controls wise, it feels like the most polished of these attempts thus far. This also supported local co-op as well as online co-op, which is honestly a really cool inclusion. I didn't bother to check and see if it'd still work on my PS3 copy, though I'm told it can still be done with the 360 version. Tekken 7 saw the return of Tekken Ball as DLC. Still though, it's a fun, if somewhat more realistic take on the minigame. Tekken 8 brought back Tekken Ball and added some complexity to it by also implementing Tekken 8's signature heat mechanic into things. Highly recommend checking out the bracket they ran for this at the Tekken World Tour 2023 finals. It's a really fun watch. Tekken 8 Story Mode, while largely being an evolution of Tekken 7's story campaign, does feature an extended Tekken Force-like segment, which was a really cool touch. Unless some kind of drastic shakeup happens with the Tekken devs going forward, I think we'll continue seeing modes like this being brought into Tekken releases, either by bringing back older sub-games, or maybe even making some new ones. Thinking about Ehrgeiz, God Bless the Ring, and single-player content, I wouldn't blame people for thinking about the single-player quest mode more than anything, since that was one of the biggest selling points of the home console release on the PS1. In addition to that though, Ehrgeiz has a few minigames that can be played against the computer and friends. The first is Battle Beach. This one's actually a set of 3 short games in one. A regular race, a flag claiming game, and a hurdle race. Whoever has the highest point total at the end wins. The next one is Battle Runner, which has you doing laps around one of a few stage maps in the game. This one looks deceptively simple, but all hell can break out depending on how petty you and your opponent want to get. There's items like one that reverses the direction you have to run to make your lap counts, which is hilarious. The more complex the map, the more things can take a left turn, and that honestly adds to the fun of it all. I wonder if Sephiroth's soldier training included dumb shit like this. The last one, and my personal favorite, is Battle Panel. Ever play Othello? This one's kind of a simplified version of that. You're assigned a color, and you have to claim your opponent's panels by surrounding them with yours. Unlike Othello, there's no turns being taken here. You and your opponent are free to run around and set down your panels, in addition to tackling them to slow them down. Even if you find yourself in a bind, eventually some new panels start to spawn in that'll allow you to make a comeback if your opponent doesn't get to them first. The key to this one is capturing what panels you can in the corners and working from there, as it's far easier to run defense and offense from that position than fighting for your life from the middle of the board. It's a fun little game, and I'm not ashamed to say I've spent entire afternoons playing this one. I can never seem to get away from talking about Toshinden in these videos, but for once, this was a pleasant surprise. This one was actually recommended by a friend who swore the minigames in this were worth the admission alone. A lot of people in the US aren't even aware Toshinden 4 exists, at least mostly because this only came out in PAL territories as far as Western releases go. This game has a time skip, taking place 10 years after the events of the last game, with a mostly new cast, though an older Eiji and Vermilion return from previous games, as well as a now teenage Naru from Toshinden 3. Eiji's son Subaru acts as the new series protagonist here. I'm gonna keep it a buck with y'all. this game is not great. Toshinden 3 was an improvement over the second game in every conceivable way, and Toshinden 4 is, well, not. So with an already sour opinion on the main course, I booted up the mini games. And y'all, these are actually really fun. Like, better than the main game fun, which I realize is damning it with faint praise, but let me explain. There's not 1, not 3, but 7 mini games in total that can be played, though some do have to be unlocked. Most of them let you play as anyone on the cast that you have unlocked and are also portrayed in a super deformed style for most of these games. The first 3 are probably the least noteworthy. The first 2 are box standard puzzle games, one basically being Puyo with numbers, and the other being a little more akin to how Puzzle Fighter works. The third one is a pretty standard but inoffensive Breakout clone. The fourth game is where they start cooking with gas a bit. It's air hockey, but with the ability to increase the amount of spots on your opponent's side to score a goal in, though the opponent can do that to you too. The fifth game, Origin, is at its core just asteroids, but they go absolutely all out on the vector graphics presentation for this. Even the character select is done through vector graphics, something that they absolutely did not have to do, but did anyway. Someone really had fun designing this mode. Next up is Fight Wolfie. You choose a pig, and the goal is to follow the button prompts to climb up the tree before your opponent, but there's a Mario Kart style item system you can use to disrupt your opponents. Sounds dumb, but this was way more fun than it had any right to be. Last is a dancing minigame, and like the previous ones, basically boils down to Simon Says. That said, I think this one's actually my favorite one covered in this video. It's snappy, the prompts are clear and easy to see, and the character models and the stage aren't too distracting. Someone should honestly put Toshinden 4 in a mystery bracket in a fighting game major and have people play the minigames. I think people would be surprised with how fun they are. So yeah, not great fighting game, surprisingly fun minigames. Smash Bros. Has always had single-player content in mind, even from its humble beginnings as a small-budget N64 game that wasn't even expected to become the juggernaut it is today. 2 of the bonus stages that can be played in the game's single-player ladder can also be played independent of it as well. Break the Targets puts your selected character in a customized course where they simply need to break 10 targets scattered throughout the level. The characters navigate this course more like a platforming game than a fighter, and oftentimes are tailored to the movesets of the character. In fact, series creator Masahiro Sakurai actually said that this subgame was conceived to serve as a tutorial for each character's moveset, instead of having a dedicated tutorial mode, to which I'd say, that's pretty genius. I specifically remember having issues as a kid with Link's target level in particular, until I realized that I could throw bombs in the air farther up by flicking the stick upwards instead of just holding up, which helped me get that last target I needed. Smash 64 also has another sub-game, Board the Platforms, and what Break the Targets does for tutorializing movesets, Board the Platforms does for individual character mobility, letting the player figure out the movement quirks of every character on their own in a controlled environment separate from the fighting. The main single-player ladder also has an exclusive game, Race to the Finish, but that one's the same for everyone and a little less notable. Smash Bros. Melee greatly expands the amount of single-player content, adding in new ways to fight like Event Mode, Coin Battles, and All-Star Mode, as well as newer side modes on top of that. Adventure Mode is the obvious thing to highlight here, for its sporadic use of platforming stages throughout its runtime, though the mode is still mostly skewed toward traditional Smash-styled fights. Those platforming stages lay the groundwork for something even bigger down the line though. Break the Targets returns its target test here, and like before are unique for every character, customizing stages even further for them. For my money though, the most fascinating of these is the Home Run contest. The premise is simple. Rack up damage on a sandbag with your character in a short amount of time, then use the Home Run bat item to hit said sandbag as far as you can. The idea is pretty straightforward, but as it turns out, there's a lot of ways you can approach this due to the nuances of each character's moveset and the time and space you're afforded in this minigame. So much so that the home run records have kind of spun off into a metagame of their own separate from Smash, with there being some world records for the home run contest alone. Abyssoft has a really good video on the subject that I highly recommend watching. Smash Bros. Brawl would bring back target test and home run contest, though the latter would be kind of a downgrade. With the cast in this series ballooning in proportion with each new entry, I suppose it was just unfeasible to make customized target stages for every character. Target Test instead has 5 separate stages of varying difficulty that every character can access. The stages aren't bad or anything, but they aren't as exciting as target tests in previous games. Home run contest is mostly the same, with one noticeable addition. There's actually a protective wall now that only dissipates right before the timer ends, allowing you to rack up damage on your end without having to worry about the sandbag accidentally launching prematurely. A pretty sensible change. The paring back of some of Brawl's single-player modes makes sense considering resources were probably funneled into the game's standout mode, Subspace Emissary. Subspace Emissary takes the idea of adventure mode from Melee and expands it into a cinematic co-op action platformer that takes cues from the Kirby series in terms of structure and pacing. Whereas Adventure Mode's platforming stages only made up around a third of Melee's Adventure Mode, the vast majority of gameplay in Subspace is platforming and boss fights, with traditional smash fights against actual opponents only being used sparingly for most of the story. Even today, this is still an absolutely wild inclusion, especially in a crossover fighter where you're lucky to even have a story at all. Outside of some voice clips, the story isn't voiced, but I don't actually find that to be a bad thing here. The characters emoting do a really good job of setting the scene, and it allows for some humorous physical comedy in scenes. Slightly off topic, but between Subspace's scenes, the Snake Codex, and the entirety of Kid Icarus Uprising, I don't think we talk enough about how great Sakurai's sense of humor is. The levels themselves are admittedly generic, especially compared to Melee's Adventure Mode, where they're more specifically themed after Nintendo locales, but they still do their best to evoke certain franchises, like some stages having Mario enemies or having Donkey Kong Country barrow sections. Each stage also uses music from Brawl's wildly expansive soundtrack, which does a great job of making some levels memorable. Whenever I think about Subspace Emissary for some reason, the first stage that comes to mind is that jungle level with Fox and Diddy Kong that uses Brawl's outstanding arrangement of Sticker Brush Symphony from Donkey Kong Country 2. And that's not even getting into the really cool boss fights against characters from Nintendo's stable of IP. As someone whose favorite Nintendo franchises are Metroid and Mother, it's a real treat through and through. Like Kirby games, there's a completion percentage tracker, and new areas will open up in previously played levels the further in you get, denoted on the world map, giving you a reason to revisit stages. Brawl's addition of stickers also plays into this mode. Applying stickers grants stat and passive buffs for your characters, giving you a fighting chance, though some stickers can only be applied to certain related characters. Sakurai's on record for saying that Subspace isn't happening again because people uploaded the cutscenes to YouTube as soon as the game was publicly available, and while I think that's pretty silly, I do think that even disregarding that, something on this scale happening again was probably always going to be a long shot. With game development ballooning in scope and cost over the last 15 years and Smash itself already being a huge production before moving to the HD era, I feel comfortable saying something like Subspace Emissary is probably never happening again. Smash Run in Smash 3DS is the last one I want to talk about, since it's the last original single-player mode in Smash that wasn't solely focused on just fighting. The setup for it actually takes cues from one of Sakurai's previous projects, City Trial and Kirby Air Ride. You get dropped into an openish environment and collect a bunch of power-ups to boost up your character under a set time limit. Once your time's up, you partake in a traditional Smash match with your buffs against other CPU opponents who also have major buffs. Pretty simple on paper, but it's the variety of standard enemies in this mode that make it really fun to tackle. Like previous adventure modes, Nintendo standbys like Koopas and Hammer Brothers are here, but you also start seeing enemies from other IP show up too, like some random Pokemon, and even Egg Robos from Sonic. A lot of the original enemies from Subspace Emissary also pop up in here as well, so there's definite variety. This is a much smaller scale mode meant to fit with Smash 3DS's more pick up and play for a few minutes nature, which is fitting for a handheld, but it does its job well. Aside from Tekken, the other big fighting game franchise known for its non-fighting game deviations is Mortal Kombat, and very specifically the 3D era of the series. Mortal Kombat Deception is, even today, one of the best single-player fighting game packages of all time. On top of the Conquest mode, which, yeah, I'll be going into in another video, in the Crypt, it introduces two alternative gameplay modes. The first is Chess Combat. It's pretty much exactly what it says on the tin, at least on the surface level. You choose your pieces as you would selecting characters before a fight, assigning them different roles, those roles corresponding to those of a chess piece. Of course, those roles can all move around the board in different ways like in chess, but unlike chess, when capturing another person's piece, it's done through combat instead, which is a really smart touch. There's also special spaces that can empower whoever sets foot on them, as well as trap areas, which can hinder you as well. I was never all that great at this, but I had a friend that was awesome at this sub-game and even kept a composition notebook full of strategies he'd written down for it. I think he even got to a point that he played it more than the main game at some point. The other game mode is Puzzle Combat, which more or less plays like Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. The art style even shifts to a more super deformed one for the characters the same way Puzzle Fighter does. I'm terrible at puzzle games, but I actually played this mode a lot via the PSP port of Deception, Mortal Kombat Unchained, a port that honestly, someone should really examine one of these days. Kind of mind-blowing that they managed to fit so much Deception in it. Puzzle Combat also appears as a bonus game in the DS port of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, another surprisingly decent handheld port. My favorite side mode overall from this series though comes from the last 3D era game, and the last game in the original timeline overall, Mortal Kombat Armageddon. Armageddon features Mortal Kombat, a whole-ass kart racing minigame that retains the super deformed art style seen in Puzzle Combat. As you'd expect, it takes cues from kart racers like Mario Kart. And while it's nowhere near as polished as Mario Kart, this is far more fun than a goofy side mode in a fighting game has any right to be. There's 5 tracks in the game, each with their own hazards and unique aesthetics, as well as 10 playable racers overall. Each racer has a power-up specific to them that they can utilize during a race. For example, Melina gets a turbo boost, and Scorpion can use his spear to pull in racers ahead of him. I'm a big fan of Jax's ground pound ability in particular, since it's a really good defensive tool to maintain your lead in the race. It's not a Mortal Kombat game without fatalities though, and this extends to the stage hazards as well, so drive carefully. Puzzle Fighter also has stage fatalities as well. You can play this one with a friend in split screen, and while I've never had the pleasure of playing this mode with other people, since I was admittedly late to the party on this game, I'd have to imagine it's pretty fun. Alright, let's rapid fire some other games I didn't have the time to dedicate segments to, but still wanted to mention all the same. Ren Blue Fantasy vs. Rising has a mode you can partake in with your lobby avatars called Grand Brews Legends, which is pretty unashamedly their take on the massively popular Fall Guys. Ren Blue also has an RPG mode, and yeah, I'll be talking about it in that future video. Power Stone's Dreamcast port allowed you to download games to the Dreamcast VMU that you could play on the unit itself. This included a flying minigame with Falcon, a shuriken throwing one with Ayame, and a slot machine one with Gunrock. Power Stone Collection on PSP actually implements these games as unlockable minigames that can be played within the game itself, which is really cool. I know I said I'd save World Tour for another video, but since I highlighted Tekken including classic Namco arcade games throughout its history, it makes sense to highlight Capcom doing the same thing in Street Fighter 6. These can be accessed a variety of ways. The Online Battle Hub has a game area with a batch of Capcom arcade games that rotate in and out on a set schedule. If you partake in the Online Fighter Pass, the paid version always grants an arcade game for permanent use as a part of the pass that can be played at any time via the Game Center option in the game's multi-menu. World Tour also has an arcade cabinet or two that can be found in Metro City and Eishao, which permanently allow you to play the entirety of Final Fight and Sansan respectively within them, which is pretty cool. Guilty Gear Dust Strikers is a platform fighter on DS with a minigame mode that predictably uses the DS touchscreen. What's interesting about these games though is that they're tied to Robokai, who uniquely can have their in-game moveset built by the player. How do you earn moves from him? By playing the minigames, of course. Thankfully, they're pretty fun overall, even if the music note one is a little tricky. Sonic Battle on the Game Boy Advance has a whole host of minigames that can be played with friends, with the only downside being that they can only be played in multiplayer. There is one single-player game though, Minehunt, which is basically a Knuckles-themed version of Minesweeper. That's going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and thanks to the patrons that support the channel. What are some of your favorite non-fighting game modes in fighting games that I didn't talk about? Let me know in the comments. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.